it seems like we've had a feast of Palestine events lately, and it won't stop here, because I want to tell you about one that's coming up, and that is December 17th. It's not even on our newsletter or anything, but it is our annual Sacco Vanzetti Memorial Award. And I'd love to tell our guests a little bit more about Sacco and Vanzetti, but off camera. Right now, I'll just tell you that the award this year, in December 17th, goes to the Holy Land Foundation 5, which I'm sure you folks know about. Their case is very similar to that of Sacco and Vanzetti, which happened between 1920 and 1927, right around when this congregation was founded. And their case, very similar sort of injustice and miscarriage of justice that happened then and happened now in almost the same way, and it's going to be really an interesting program. Miko Peled is who is going to be with us to sort of give us an orientation about the case. He wrote a book about the Holy Land Foundation 5. So look for that event. We're very excited about that. That's a Saturday evening, December 17th. And aside from that, I just want to welcome our visitors from Gaza. I really am overjoyed that you're with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing about this new book, Light in Gaza. And we also very much welcome this collaboration with American Friends Service Committee. We have a long history of all sorts of collaborations and cooperations and co-sponsorships with AFSC. So it's really a pleasure for us to have you here in our humble space. I hope you all will also, while you're here, drink in the gallery exhibition of artwork that's the work of Diane Esmond, or as her name is in French, Diane Esmond. Maybe I exaggerated that a little bit. But Diane Esmond was born in 1901 and died in 1981. Her son is a very active member of our church, and her paintings were in their basement, and they've offered them up here as a beautiful way to decorate our space, and also they're for sale. All proceeds to benefit the Community Church of Boston's very ambitious construction projects. So we welcome all you who are joining us online and on YouTube, Zoom, and other places. And I want to thank Amar Ahmad and Charlie Welch for being our tech gurus who helped me through an hour and a half of tech nightmare here. But 5 minutes before, I think we resolved everything, and we're ready to start this program. And I want to introduce you from American Friends Service Committee, Jennifer Bing.
Thank you so much. It's great. Thank you so much, Dean, for bringing us into this beautiful space. My name is Jennifer Bing, and I'm the program director at the Palestine Activism Program at the American Friends Service Committee. And while my tenure with AFSC doesn't go back quite as far as AFSC's involvement in Gaza, I wasn't alive in 1948, I have worked with AFSC for a long time. I actually got my start in advocacy and activism work here in Boston, so it's always great to come back. I was an intern at the AFSC office in 1981. So yeah, it's been a few decades, and I always remember from that time period the great intersectional work that we did. We didn't call it that at the time, but the great work for really bridging activism and academia in a special way that I always think about Boston in that way. So I have to say we're really excited about being here to talk about the book. I want to acknowledge tonight that we live on the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples. This land is the territory of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples who were caretakers of this land for centuries before oppression by European colonists who committed the crimes of war, forced relocation, taking indigenous children from their families and placing them in assimilationist boarding schools and other tools of white supremacy. We abhorred the ongoing structures of colonialism and white supremacy and commit ourselves to the ongoing efforts to name, illuminate, and deconstruct these structures. Tonight we will be talking about Israeli occupation, colonization, and apartheid, but we also acknowledge that our own land's history of genocidal settler colonialism. I'd like to thank tonight's co-sponsors, the Water Justice Alliance Project in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace Boston, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Transnational Literature Series at the Brookline Booksmith, who are selling books here tonight. So get your copies. We're excited to sign them at the end of the evening. Thanks as well to my colleague Shireen Akram-Bushar, who helped make arrangements for tonight's program. Well, yay, Shireen. Thank you, everyone. While I come from the great city of Chicago, I am well aware of the many people in this room who have a real deep connection to Palestine and to freedom for Gaza. And I thank you all for showing up for this evening, despite the busyness of our lives and as all we try to readjust to in-person events during a pandemic. For many months, I've been dreaming of seeing our book be published and tour with our speakers tonight in the US. We've traveled from Chicago to Washington, DC, to Philadelphia, to New York, and tonight we're here in Boston. As you will hear from our presenters tonight, the effort to break the isolation of Palestinians in Gaza is challenging at every level. Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire is a book and a project of the American Friends Service Committee and the product of collaboration between activists, academics, and writers in Palestine, the United States, and in Europe. We began our work on this book in the summer of 2020 and are thrilled that it is now available through Haymarket Books. We ask the contributors to help us imagine the future of Gaza beyond the cruelties of occupation and apartheid. We feel these 12 Palestinian writers guide us to think about what may be possible while reaffirming the critical role of Gaza in Palestinian identity, history, and liberation. The anthology includes essays and poems by Asma Abu Mizaid, Mossab Abu Toha, Shahad Abu Salame, Dogham Abu Salim, Salim Al-Qudwa, Rafat Al-Arir, Basman Al-Darawi, Yusuf Al-Jamal, Isra Jamal, Noor Naeem, and Suhail Taha. This book is a project, and the ideas therein challenge the blockade Israel has imposed on Gaza and represents an example of intellectual defiance and resistance. It shows that ideas, passages, poems, and verses cannot be contained and besieged beyond Israel's fences and walls. And the words of my colleague Jihad Abu Salim, Israel can besiege our bodies, but cannot besiege our minds, spirits, and words. I'm honored to have been part of the team that made this book project possible. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow co-editors, Jihad Abu Salim and Mike Merriman-Lotz at AFSC, and the editorial committee that provided us with incredible guidance and support. Tarek Bakoni, Ann Lesh, Sarah Roy, who's with us tonight in the audience, and Steve Tamari. All of us were deeply involved in every aspect of the book, from selecting the cover by Palestinian artist Malik Matar, to working with authors across time zones. We are grateful for the support of the Lannan Foundation and to Haymarket Books for their excellent editorial team. Tonight, I'm excited to introduce to you two of the writers from our anthology, Asma Abu Mazaid and Yusuf Al-Jamal, and my fellow co-editor, Jihad Abu Salim. They may look familiar to you, as Asma has often been a guest on Zoom webinars from her home in Gaza, offering critical analysis and insights into the impact of Gaza's isolation and the need for change. Yusuf was a visitor to the U.S. as part of the 2014 Gaza Writes Back book tour. He showed us then his amazing talent as a storyteller and got to appreciate our many seasons in April. It snowed for him in Chicago in April. I know Jihad Abu Salim is known to many of you here in Boston, as he has made this his residence while his partner finishes her graduate work here. Jihad is both a scholar and an activist. He is finishing his PhD in the History and Hebrew and Judaic Studies program, joint program at New York University, while also working with AFSC as the Education and Policy Coordinator for our Palestine Activism Program. Jihad joined AFSC the day after the Great March of Return started in Gaza in 2018, and since then has been a critical part of our efforts to lead education and advocacy efforts on Gaza and Palestine. We've done some amazing work together, including a previous national speaking tour featuring Ahmed Abu Artema, a Gaza-based Palestinian writer and dreamer who inspired us all in 2019 to start thinking in fresh ways about what might be possible in a future-free Palestine. As Jihad will explain tonight, that is a central motivation for our publishing this new anthology. Asma has had quite the long and difficult journey to arrive here in the United States from her home in Gaza. We are grateful that she was willing to spend a few weeks with us here, sharing her deep knowledge of Gaza's rich agricultural history and the challenges that face both people and the land due to occupation, colonization, and apartheid. She is a specialist in social inclusion and addresses gender and impact of climate change in the agricultural sector. Asma contributed 2 chapters to Light in Gaza, one on the lost identity of peasantry and nature, and a short essay on why Palestinians in Gaza hold on to their phones and record the horror they experience during Israeli bombing attacks. Yusuf is a working writer and journalist, but also about to defend his PhD thesis at the Middle East Institute at Sakarya University in Turkey. We are grateful that he has taken time off this month to come and tour with us to several U.S. cities. Yusuf has published short stories, articles for online publications, and translated stories of Palestinian prisoners, including a book in 2021 entitled A Shared Struggle, Stories of Palestinian and Irish Hunger Strikers. Yusuf's chapter in Light in Gaza is a topic that every Palestinian from Gaza can relate: the freedom of movement, or the lack thereof. Yusuf's own family experience is an example of how Israel's efforts to fragment and divide Palestinians leads to devastating consequences. Yusuf's descriptions of travel restrictions and what should be done to overcome them help us to imagine a future where Palestinians in Gaza have a right to be part of the world. So, usually I stop with that, but tonight I get to also be the moderator. I've prepared some questions, and I will have this conversation and then open it up to all of you to join in the conversation. And I should say that I didn't share the questions with them, so they're really going to be on their toes having to answer these questions. So, and I've had such a privilege getting to listen to all three of you speak these last weeks, and I'm going to begin with you, Jihad, because in all the events that we've done, you just create such a great overview, both to audiences and also in the introduction in the book. And so I want to ask you the basic question about why a book on Gaza and why now?
Thank you, Jennifer, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Although this is the perfect day, like to stay home, away from the elements, rain and whatnot. But I'm personally grateful for you to join us tonight, and for those also who are joining via Zoom or YouTube. So why Gaza, and why a book on Gaza, and why now? When it comes to Palestine and Palestinian history, the Palestinian past, present, and the future, Gaza has been an important part of the Palestinian story, the Palestinian saga, the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation. And Gaza will continue to be an important part of that story. And today, it's really hard to think about the Palestine question with all of its details and issues and challenges without including Gaza. And for many, many reasons, it's become difficult for organizers, for activists to talk about Gaza and to include Gaza in conversations, because we've become accustomed to only talking about Gaza during Israel's seasonal bombardment every 3 or 4 years. There are the conversation around Gaza on the level of the international community and how it's approached by states, by international organizations, has also become limited. So in a way, this book responds to a number of frustrations that we as Palestinians from Gaza share, and also as activists who try to raise awareness on the situation in the Gaza Strip and push for changes of policy. And some of those frustrations have to do with what kind of conversations exist on Gaza. And Gaza is talked about in different ways. I think the major ways it's talked about are either through a humanitarian discourse that reduces the reality there into, the tragic story of hapless victims who happen to be oppressed under an unjust blockade, which is true. Gaza is also reduced to a question of security. It concerns Israel's security. And in this discourse, Gaza is just, represents security challenges to the state of Israel, and that's how it's perceived, especially in circles where, Israel and Israel's supporters talk about Gaza. And another also way Gaza is talked about as this place where heroes and martyrs live, those formidable people who have been resilient for decades and are capable of the impossible. And while that also is true, I think a place where more than 2 million people live is worthy of understanding, of a nuanced way of making sense of the experiences, the rich and diverse experiences of people there. So in thinking about how we as activists can proactively address those problematic ways through which Gaza is approached, whether maliciously or not. We wanted to create a conversation around Gaza, but make sure that the conversation is happening on our terms, and that we are, not only telling the stories, but also setting the terms of how can this part of Palestine, how can these experiences of those 2 million Palestinians can be talked about, and most importantly, what kind of politics we think should be present when thinking about Gaza and the plight of the Palestinian people there. So I think one of the things this book does, and I think my colleagues will talk about it, is that it ties the reality in Gaza to the overall Palestinian experience and to the overall Palestinian story. And it ties and it links Gaza's current reality to the bigger questions about what needs to happen in order for Palestinians to achieve their freedom, dignity, and the oppression that they have been subject to. And in light of the failure of all frameworks that have been put in place over the past few decades, and the revival of how Palestinians have been pushing over the past few years of the need to understand that at the root of every Palestinian tragedy, at the root of every Palestinian suffering, whether in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, in the diaspora, or even within the what is known today as the State of Israel, that the Nakba, the catastrophe that unfolded since 1948, needs to be centered as an important way of making sense of the Palestinian experience. So, although the book tackles different issues, social, economic, political, and even talks about the Palestinian experience through, literary contributions, it does take into account the centrality of 1948 as a year not only when Palestinians suffered from disruptions that affected their lives and fragmented their country, but also put in place a set of processes that rendered them and continue to render them discriminated against and victims of this project to raise them, uproot them, and keep them, away from their land and kick them out from their country. So that's, I think, the book tries to push for a much more informed conversation about Gaza, with Palestinians from Gaza being participants and active participants in this conversation. And it also tries to invite people to think about Gaza in terms of politics that go beyond the fragmentation of the Palestinian experience and the failed frameworks that have been imposed on Palestinians over the past few decades that didn't take us anywhere. I mean, it took us somewhere, not a pleasant place. So I think that's what the book does, and I think, why now? Gaza, with every day that passes, Palestinians there witness violence, and, the passage of time alone in Gaza is violent. So we should have started a conversation about Gaza yesterday. So this book tries to address this seasonal attention problem that Gaza suffers from and push people to think about Gaza all the time.
Great. Thank you. My follow-up question was going to be about how you talk about the erasure of context and centering the Nakba, and you just, even without that prompt, you already explained that part of it. Another goal of the book was to include writings that weave together the personal and political narrative. And the opening of the book has a chapter by Rafat Al-Arir, who shares his personal experience of life in Gaza through multiple stages of his life. And at the end of this powerful essay, Rafat writes, "When I was approached to write this book, the promise was that it will affect change and that policies, especially in the United States, will be improved. But honestly, will they? Does a single Palestinian life matter? Does it? Reader, as you peruse these chapters, what can or will you do knowing what you do can save lives and change the course of history. Reader, will you make this matter? Okay. So when you got that essay, when you read it for the first time, how did that impact you, getting that from Rafat? You could say.
I was lucky to have met Rifat in Gaza in 2005. I was still a child, and he taught me English. So I think one of the reasons why I speak English today is because he was one of the people who taught me English. And you know, and he was one of those charismatic, influential educators that once you cross paths with, your entire life changes. And I always, you know, looked up to him as a role model and as someone who inspired me to learn and to grow and to challenge the mental and intellectual walls that have been built around us. I remember Rifat teaching me about Malcolm X in Gaza and how liberating that was for someone like me, you know, finding freedom in the journeys of others who sought their answers. And when I received the chapter, it's a chapter that is very personal, and I never thought in my life that Rifat would be willing to share that much about his life, because he has been an educator who empowers young people through teaching them English, but also how to think and write in English. He teaches English literature and he's big on Shakespeare. And for me, it was really difficult to read that piece because, you know, Rifat tried to talk about Gaza, write about Gaza, tell Gaza's stories, encourage young people to tell their stories living in Gaza for a very long time. And I think the fact that he chose to write this piece in which he shares all these details about his life growing up in Gaza and living there and all the challenges that he faced and all the levels of oppression that him and his family and his neighbors and friends and schoolmates were subject to and have been subject to and will continue to subject to, it felt for me that, you know, on one hand, it's a powerful story and it's worth learning. But at the same time, you know, it was really difficult for me to see that at what point do we, you know, and Asma says that in every event, and I think it's a very powerful note to make. At what point is it enough that we keep telling those stories? Until when should we make ourselves vulnerable and expose the pain and the trauma and the wounds and talk about how difficult, how humiliating, how violent this experience has been and continues to be. So for me, I think, you know, that yes, it's very powerful to write one story and to share it, but at the same time, this book can also be seen as an act of protest and an act of defiance. But protest and defiance and, you know, any of these tactics they have to have people at the receiving end of it. And like the Great March of Return, right? Like, you know, Palestinians protested for 2 years. And these appeals, if not heard, and if they do not become sources of inspiration for people to do something about them, then it's just us being tormented over and over again and forced to relive our traumas over and over again. And that's, I think, what the challenge is for us here. And that's like for me, you know, I'm supposed to be here and there at the same time. The challenge for us here is to ensure that these stories are not just told for us to listen to them and feel sympathy and understand, but also to encourage ourselves and others to take action and work to change these realities on the ground.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Asma, you contributed 2 pieces to our anthology, although initially you submitted 1 piece on the loss of identity of peasantry and nature. You write, despite Israel's continuous attempts at erasure, the narrative of the land, villages, and geography endured, continuously passed from first-generation refugees to their children and grandchildren, who memorize it by heart. Palestinian refugees would gather in their camps to tell the stories of their lives before the Nakba and their exodus as a collective remembrance. You share several Arabic proverbs and sayings about the land in your chapter, including your grandmother's wise words about the value of land. Can you share some of this history and how you see that history challenged today by the impact of occupation, blockade, and the environmental crisis?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for coming here despite like the rain. I'm someone coming from the Mediterranean, so I value sun, not cold. In my chapter, one of the things that I was trying really to understand is how has the Palestinian relationship with the land that was really practiced a lot through like agricultural practices and also environmental practices, has it changed from a saying of my grandmother who used to say like a lab filled with soil is more precious than a lab filled with gold, which is حجر تراب ولا حجر ذهب. And how would people value that land beyond, you know, the economic visibility of it and like, you know, the harvesting and so on. And I work in the area of women economic justice in the agriculture sector. So like going there and like working with farmers, the image has completely flipped into like farmers mainly seeking, you know, humanitarian assistance. So like what happened to that kind of like, you know, dignity and that kind of like very strong attachment to the land, to options where people are pushing their sons and daughters away from practicing agriculture and being peasant, and also like, you know, practicing even like more environmentally conscious behaviors. And to be honest, when I started like this writing, I didn't know at the early stages, I didn't know if that's something that could be talked about in Gaza. And even during that kind of research, there has been very rare documentation and archiving of Gaza and like agriculture in Gaza after 1948. But through the research and the reading, what was very interesting for me to see is that how Palestinian farming identity at the early of the 20th century has been a very expanded identity. Like the Palestinian farmer in early 1930s was really, they were really organizing. They were like, you know, protesting against the British imperialism, against the taxation that used to be imposed on them. They have participated greatly into the great revolution that happened in 1936 until 1939. And like, actually the villages and the rural area were, you know, the main center and incubator of all that revolution that really sustained for 3 years. So the fact that we did have this modality of Palestinian farmers being a social agent, asking for like, you know, social agenda and like social demands, particularly in the 30s, and also were like, you know, fighting freedom fighters and at the same time like mobilizers and organizers, was a model that we don't see anymore. So like what happened between that time and now? And one of the main historic events that Jihad talked about, and Yusuf will also mention, is the 1948, because it really has resulted in a structural re-engineering in Gaza and what's known to be the Gaza Strip now. The Gaza Strip now was not, it used to be called Qada Gaza, and it used to have more than 54 Palestinian villages and like 3 large cities. Now, the fact that there was this amount of villages, it means that most of the people there practiced agriculture, and they really has engaged in some sort of like subsistence economy that, you know, support each other. And suddenly when 1948 happened, those people not only like lost their lives and family members, they also lost the land that, you know, reinforced that kind of identity. And suddenly they found themselves in what's known now as the Gaza Strip, which is very poor in terms of like natural resources compared to like, you know, Qada Gaza. And the person who used to own a land and like would say that with pride, now he or she has to stay in a refugee camps, depend on a humanitarian assistance from UNRWA, or even like working as waged labor. So that has resulted in a huge, you know, reshaping of that relationship with land. And that was something I saw through that kind of like, you know, digging and researching during the chapter. Now, what was interesting also for me to see is that how, you know, we attach Gaza with a specific, you know, agricultural commodities. So like when you think of Gaza, you think about the strawberry and the journey of the strawberry. But when you actually research strawberry, you would realize how strawberry is an example of, you know, colonial agriculture, because strawberry was not an indigenous, you know, crop. It's a crop that actually consumes a lot of the environmental resources that exist, consumes water, and has been used by Israeli companies to penetrate European market until they come up with the perfect, most efficient model of, you know, growing strawberry that does not consume water aquifer. So that was like some of the things that I was trying to say, is that we did have a model in the past where like farmers have been very proactive. And if we want to reimagine the future, we need to understand also like what models have Palestinian portrayed over the past, and how can we understand our present so that we can reimagine the future.
And are there ideas that, I know you've talked about like how you've seen in the West Bank attempts to kind of preserve agriculture and reconnect people to the land. What do you think needs to be in place for that sort of viable imagining in Gaza? Like what needs to change, or what can make it possible?
I really think number one is knowledge. The fact that, you know, for me, I had to go through that journey of writing the chapter in order for me to now walk pass by a tree and then ask myself, how long has this tree has been here? What kind of like events has this tree has witnessed? Is this tree an indigenous one or not? How can we preserve it? And I think the fact that, you know, not all people can have the luxury of like going through such journeys. So how can we, the question that I was left with is, how can we bring that knowledge, that experience and understanding of our Palestinian oral history in terms of agriculture, but also our indigenous trees and crops, and linking that with the political, how can we bring that into a space that is easy for children to understand, for adults and so on. And we were discussing, even like before this trip, is the importance maybe of having a space, it could be a museum, it could be anything else, that really like bring that kind of knowledge forward for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in areas that is not even accessible, to kind of like reignite that kind of conversation about it.
So as editors, we have the opportunity to order the chapters and to look and develop themes. So after your chapter on identity and agriculture, we include a poem by Besmam al-Darawi called "Why Are You Still Here?" And the last stanza of the poem reads, "I keep asking myself, why are you still here? Sometimes I'm lost in answering until I see my grandfather take a nap under his olive tree before the colonizer came and ended his life." I think this poem about trauma and also about the steadfast resolve to survive picks up on a theme in your second contribution to the book that you wrote during the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2021, when that was actually when we had our first publishing deadline, was that month. You write a very powerful essay about the need for Palestinians in Gaza to hold onto their phones and record their experiences. You write, "We record to document not for their," meaning the international community's sake, "but for ours." Can you say more about this?
Thank you, Jennifer. So, as Jennifer has said, like that essay was not even intended for the book. For me, writing, and like I consider them rambling more than writing, was one way to stay sane during the aggression times, and that particular time where it was, 2 days before that, the main constant feeling that I had was really how death is much easier than life during these times, because the idea of like experiencing all that, and like the idea when you just get to the hang of it and like try to know which airstrike, how to protect yourself, like how to navigate it in a place like Gaza, when you just think that you can navigate it well and like stay sane, the weapons that they use, Israel use, messes up all this kind of like, layers of protection that you put into your mind. So the reason why I wrote that rambling was mainly we've seen so much destruction during the May 2021 and the use of carpet bombing, where like a whole neighborhood is like completely, destroyed. And we've also seen people running away, like, and having their phone and recording all that kind of like evidences. And the main reaction of people is either like being numb to such scenes, or asking a question like, how fake is this, or proving that they want more validation of these documentation, and experiencing that and reading this and seeing all of that. It kind of like say why we are writing to international community, because we have been documenting all our lives and nothing has changed. And I think my only fear that I had at that time was, what would the future Palestinian generation living in Gaza say if we don't record, if they don't see what we are experiencing on a daily basis? When they look at a number that says that 200,000 Palestinian has tried to seek immigration from Gaza, to migrate from Gaza, either tried or succeeded, and they look back after like 20, 30 years, their main answer is like, oh, they were not brave enough, or that they choose the easy way. And the reason why I've written that we need to document for our future generation, because I really want our future generation to understand that the circumstances that has, shaped our suffering, are the circumstances written by us, heard from us, not by someone else. And we've seen how historically Israel tried to erase a lot of the documentation that was happening since 1948. So we know that we have very little spaces to have our voices heard. And we think that, and I think it's important for us to document and tell our narratives in our own voices.
So, Yusuf, you have written about a key issue for Palestinians in Gaza, and that is freedom of movement and family reunification. Your personal family stories illustrate the impact of fragmentation and isolation caused by travel restrictions. Can you share with us how generations in your family have been impacted by what you call the continuing Nakba?
Thank you, Jennifer, for finally asking me. I was falling asleep. No, this is a joke. Okay, everyone is wake up now. So it started in 1948. The fragmentation and Nakba, the concept of ongoing catastrophe and Nakba has impacted my family starting from that year, 1948, when my extended family was split into two. So we used to live in a village in central Palestine called Aqir, near Ramle and Lod today. And Zionist militias have invaded the village, killed my great-grandfather, and split the family into two. So Palestinians in the village were displaced, they were made refugees, and half of my extended family ended up in the West Bank. That's where my mother comes from. The other half ended up in the Gaza Strip. That's where my father comes from. That's where I grew up. So it's been 73 years of fragmentation and splitting our families up. Ironically, we were reunited again. Our extended family was united again under Israel's occupation in 1967, when Israel finished the job and occupied what remained of historic Palestine, that is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Then, so it took 19 years of fragmentation for my grandfather's generation, and to be able to reconnect with their relatives and family again. And it did not stop there. It's generational in the sense that it impacted my grandfather, it impacted my father, and it's impacting me and my nephews and nieces now. So in 1978, after this unification between Gaza and the West Bank, quote unquote, under occupation, military occupation, my father was able to visit his distant uncle in the West Bank and his family in Bethlehem, and that's how he met my mother. So he went to his uncle's house, he knocked on the door, my mother opened the door, she saw him, they fell in love, and they made 13 babies. 13. Okay, I am one of 13. So, but then my mother had to move to Gaza, and this is another, journey of torture under occupation. She had to change her address and ID. So Israel has different sets of laws that govern how they treat Palestinians who hold Gaza IDs, West Bank IDs, Jerusalem IDs, and Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. The worst type of IDs that a Palestinian might get is the Gaza ID. So my mother was not aware of the implications of that. She just thought, like an American changing his address from Chicago to New York. Let's not talk about the pizza now, but it's easy, You don't have to struggle a lot because you change your address from one city to another. No, in the case of Palestine, especially moving from the West Bank to Gaza, it's the worst decision a Palestinian may take. So in Israel's eyes, she became a Gazan citizen. She was not able to visit her family for 12 years after the first second Palestinian Intifada, broke out. It took her 12 years to get an Israeli permit to see her own family, which lives an hour away. Her parents passed away in 2003 and 2008, and she was not able to participate in the funeral procession. Israel denied her a permit because Israel uses, this system of, permits to collectively punish Palestinians. And the easy answer is security threat. You're not allowed to travel. You never what this means. You never know what this means. And it impacts, families, old and young, men and women, students, patients. It impacts everyone. So moving from my grandfather to my mother and father, also my father struggled from travel restrictions on a different layer. I grew up in Block A, or Kalabosh, which means shackles and chains, because it literally used to be used as a prison during the First World War. Then the Allied forces left and it became a refugee community. So the gate in and out was actually the actual gate of the prison. So I literally grew up in what used to be a prison in Gaza. And imagine like the psyche of growing up in what used to be a prison in the biggest open air prison in the world, that is Gaza. And the fact that my memory of the first Palestinian